You are now listening to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast, brought to you by Buckeye Grove. For all the latest Buckeyes news, analysis, reaction, and the best Ohio State community on the entire internet, head over to buckeyegrove.com or follow us on Twitter at Ohio State Rivals. Without any further delay, it's time to get unscripted, broadcasting from Podcast Central, a place that is not his mother's basement.
Hey, Mom! We get some meatloaf!
We promise. Here's your host, Kyle Lamb.
Hey, Mom! The meatloaf!
Good Friday, everybody. Welcome to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast, presented by BuckeyeGrove.com. I am your host, Kyle Lamb. You might be listening on a Thursday rather than on a Friday, and that is because this episode has been released just a little bit earlier due to the excitement and the interest surrounding one of my guests today. I have two guests that I'm very excited about. Of course, the one that I've done the biggest tease for is the infamous Reddit attorney. You probably have seen some of his work on Reddit. He's done a couple cross posts, done two very deep dives into the legal situations. The first one was more about Brett McMurphy's reporting, some of the journalistic malpractice, if you will, that he's observed throughout the process, some of his edits of Facebook posts, and that sort of thing. And, of course, the second one was more of a legal nature, more about Ohio State's requirement to report, Urban Meyer's requirement to report whether or not the Title IX and sexual misconduct policies apply to this situation. So he is coming up here on the show. You might be wondering why he's anonymous, and that's a fair question. I will let him answer that. He and I have discussed this. He's given me the reasons. They make perfect sense to me. But I will let him explain that for himself. I will ask him when he comes on, and you can get in his words why he chooses to attach his name to all this reporting. But I can tell you this. I have verified his identity. I've verified his practice. He is a practicing attorney in the state of Ohio. I've verified his bar number. I have done all the background work on this, and he is who he says he is. I've spoken with him. I've called his practice. I can promise you this guy is legit, and you will want to hear what he has to say. Later on in the program, also great guest, one of my favorites, Bill Bender of the Sporting News. Talked to him many times in the past year on various podcasts, and I'm glad he's back on the show. We'll get into the Ohio State investigation with him as well, but we're also going to talk some actual football because, as you know, football practice has begun at Ohio State, and Bill was there in attendance the other day. So he's got some observations. He'll tell you what he thought of Dwayne Haskins, the pass game, Brian Hartline. We've got a lot of things we'll get into with him. And like I said, we will touch on the investigation a little bit, but it's going to be some football talk on top of that. So Bill Bender coming up later in the show. But first, let's get right into the interview with the Reddit attorney. You're going to want to hear this. All right, we're here now with the interview you have long been waiting for, the attorney that has been infamous for his work, his legal analysis posted on Reddit. He is the attorney that has been covering this like no other. For sake of clarity, since we're doing this anonymously, I'm going to call you Bob Loblaw, or Bob for short. But so first of all, welcome to the show, and I appreciate you taking the time and all the time you've done, covering this. It's been fantastic work, but thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Glad to be here. Glad to discuss this even further.
So let's start first. Talk a little bit about yourself. Talk about your practice. And obviously you're an attorney in the state of Ohio. So speak a little bit to that and tell us what you're comfortable in sharing.
Sure. I'm a solo practitioner. I was at a firm for a while, but then I went out on my own so I could spend 20 hours during the week writing about Ohio State instead of doing billable hours. But I generally handle civil litigation matters. I'm also on the criminal appointed list. In terms of education, I did go to Ohio State. I don't think that would surprise anybody at this point, but I went there for undergrad and law school. And, I know there are some people who would think, well, that kind of detracts from the analysis. And instead of that, I would just ask that you respond to my actual analysis and not diminish the fact that just because I went to Ohio State that somehow discredits anything. But yeah, I am an actual attorney. I have a practice.
So I want to follow up here. A lot of people have questioned they've said it would probably be great promotion, great marketing for you to get your name out in conjunction with this for all the work you've done. So what would be the reason you give for requesting the anonymity here in this interview and on your Reddit posts?
Well, I office share with 5 other lawyers, and I'm a solo practitioner, so we're not a firm, but we all share a phone line. We share the copier and all the expenses of the office here. So we all have a common number, phone number, and if you Googled my name, my number comes up right there. And I don't want my the colleagues I work with, I don't want their practices disrupted at all, because I decided to spend a dumb amount of time on Reddit posting about all this. But in that sense too, if you're listening, and I assume maybe a couple of my friends may listen, just text me or something. Don't post like, oh, I know who it is. Just leave that be. I would respectfully request that on behalf of the guys that I office with.
What interested you in this case in the first place, and what motivated you maybe to spend so much time covering it and writing about it?
Well, the first thing is that I noticed the change in stories, and those may have slipped to a lot of people, but when a lawyer reads those things, arrest versus investigation is something that's size 72, bold, underlined, caps lock font. It just screamed off the page to me, and thought, I thought there was an arrest, and I went and looked at it, and then one thing led to another, and I was like, oh, wow, this whole thing has been edited, and the goalposts are moving, and that I didn't think that was fair. But given those inaccuracies, the media coverage still sounds like it is related to the initial allegations, and those allegations aren't accurate. I don't want to go too far, but 3 analogous examples, and I know people will just say, "Oh, that's whataboutism. That's whataboutism. You can't talk about that." These are just 3 analogous examples where nobody was calling for the head coach's job. So when Alabama signed that player from Georgia, he allegedly committed domestic violence. He transfers to Alabama, and he commits domestic violence there. Nobody was calling for Nick Saban's job. Just recently, the Astros signed that reliever Osuna, and he was actually suspended by Major League Baseball for violating their domestic violence policy. I think he was suspended for 75 games. Nobody is calling for the Astros general manager, the Astros manager, or their vice president to be fired over it. And then the third one, the whole, Colorado example. It's almost the exact same cases here. Nobody was calling for him to be fired over that. And, the only distinction between Ohio State and Colorado is that Ohio State has 8 national championships and, God knows how many All-Americans. The coverage and the narrative just don't match. And now that upset me to enough of a degree that I've probably written 10 or 11,000 words and spent way too much time covering this, but whatever, it's been fun. So.
Okay, so we're going to get into the bulk of the interview now, and so for clarity's sake, I want everybody to realize we're going to kind of break this up into 2 parts here. We're going to first kind of focus on the media aspect of this, Brett McMurphy's reporting, what has led to getting where we're at right now, and then we'll get into the legal aspect, the Ohio State Urban Meyer angle. After that, we'll talk about, of course, was he obligated to report? What is Title IX? What is sexual misconduct policy? We'll get into all of that, but we'll break this up into 2 segments. So let's start with the media aspect. If you would, just kind of talk about the media coverage as a whole, and do you have any thoughts about how this has been covered, not only from Brett, but nationally?
Well, nationally, like I just said, I don't think the criticism matches what's going on here based on the prior coverage of similar and analogous events. But, I do want to make a broad point whether it's political media or sports media, we refuse to accept nuance or recognize that two things can be simultaneously true. We seem to have picked sides. You either want Urban Meyer fired or you don't want him fired, and you're an enabler. That's not fair. You can think that domestic violence is, and you should think that domestic violence is terrible, that it should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law in a court of law, and that's a good opinion. It's also a completely separate issue, and it is also true that reporting on this is just an absolute abomination. It just is. We're trying to distract from the issue. No, they're both things can be true. I think it's fair to say, and we'll run down through everything. If Brett McMurphy did this at ESPN or at SI or at Yahoo or wherever, he may be on paid administrative leave right now. I think that's completely fair to say. But I've only seen one columnist, Ari Wasserman, say that in writing, but nobody's talked about it, and it's just kind of bothered me, obviously.
So let's start at the top, if you would. Kind of let's go down a rundown of the timeline of McMurphy's reporting, and I know this is something you expressed in great detail in your first Reddit post. So if you would kind of take us through the timeline of events for McMurphy's reporting as you've uncovered this.
Well, as long as that first Reddit post was, I actually didn't discuss everything that I thought was unethical about it. And just for the record, I was a journalism major for 3 years at Ohio State, which makes me a complete expert on journalistic ethics. Obviously, just kidding. But, I generally, I read a lot of news. I read the New York Times. I read the Post. But here's my summary. July 23rd, McMurphy releases the report about the protective order and the alleged violation of the protective order. McMurphy didn't reach out to Zach Smith's attorney for comment, and he still hasn't done that throughout. And I just want to emphasize here, reporters almost always reach out to the other side for comment. I had a friend here who was criminally appointed for defending a person who walked into a house of a 94-year-old great-grandmother and beat her to death to steal like $100. He was quoted in the paper, and he was talking about his client's position. So there's no excuse to me not to reach out to Zach Smith's attorney initially or ever throughout this entire thing. So anyways, then McMurphy goes and he reports of a second incident. And as we all know, this is the one where he says it's an arrest when there was no arrest. McMurphy failed to call the Powell Police Department to verify his report. He failed to confirm with Courtney Smith's attorney that Zach Smith was arrested. Failed to reach out to Zach Smith's attorney again. Then we have the Big Ten Media Day, which was apparently journalistic Viagra to McMurphy because that has sent him on this mission of his. He put Meyer's quote in his Twitter bio. He references it nearly every report. He reports on July 24th. Again, he's still using the wrong language. He goes and edits his Facebook posts without retractions. Still doesn't reach out to Zach Smith's attorney for comment. Over the next week, he edits 2 different Facebook posts without issuing corrections, even though, for 50 years, the New York Times has been issuing all of its corrections on page A2 of its paper, even if they so as much spell a name wrong. August 1st, he issues the report, the disturbing report about the text messages allegedly sent from Courtney Smith to Shelley Meyer. But I didn't see anything in that report about the text messages being corroborated or authenticated. I didn't see anything about reaching out to Zach Smith's attorneys for comment. no reaching out to the university, no reaching out to Shelley or Urban Meyer. That night, he goes on SVP and says Urban knew, and then when Scott Van Pelt asks him, "Well, did you know?" Do you have direct knowledge of that? And McMurphy admits no. August 3rd, he publishes another text message from Courtney Smith to Zach Smith. Again, nothing about it being corroborated or authenticated.
Can I ask you a real quick follow-up? Could you explain the concept behind being authenticated and what courts would be looking for to authenticate a text message?
Well, I mean, you can do, and I want to preface this by saying I have no factual reason to think that these text messages are altered in any way. But text messages are very difficult to get admitted into evidence, especially screenshots. Everyone thinks, screenshots are like the money thing you can have. But, you can, in these screenshots, you can't see what dates they are. You can delete text messages to make the responses look different. You can do all sorts of things with text messages. And so the court requires you to basically corroborate with the service provider, and then you have to do all sorts of things to get it into evidence. I did not see anything in Brett McMurphy's reporting that he did, in fact, reach out to, the carrier or here, whether she's Sprint or T-Mobile or whatever. I think that's important. Like I said in my one post, the rules of evidence have developed over 800 years, and it's basically lawyers saying, here's what we think is fair if we're going to accuse somebody of a crime. I just did not see a lot of due diligence there. Again, I have no reason to doubt the veracity of those text messages, but I think some reporting on the authentication of those would have been, beneficial. But, anyways, so you posted another text message, no authentication there. On August 6th, he publishes a statement basically on behalf of Courtney Smith's attorney. Still has not reached out to Zach Smith's attorneys for comment. On August 8th, he publishes excerpts from Shelley Meyer's speech in 2015. Just no idea what that's about. August 7th, he publishes information about Zach Smith getting raises. And God forbid the raises he got in the years after Ohio State made the playoff were larger than the year after they didn't win the Big Ten or made the playoff. So he reported it on that. And now we're 18 days into this. McMurphy apparently has yet to reach out to Urban Meyer, Shelley Meyer, Zach Smith's attorney, or the university. And interspersed throughout all this, and I've been blabbering on about McMurphy for 5 minutes now, is he's made a lot of evidentiary leaps, a lot of inferences that are not supported by the facts, and the media has largely run with those inferences, and that is kind of why we are dealing with the napalm situation that's going on in Columbus right now.
I think an interesting aspect of this within the reporting was, on July 30, when he basically changed the language from Zach Smith was arrested to Zach Smith was investigated. And it was just interesting because it was such a subtle change, but yet the language was so, you could tell he had to back off. And I thought that was interesting how he worded it from one to the next. It was almost like he wanted to slip it under there and make that change without anybody noticing.
Yeah, and I'm not going to enter Urban Meyer's brain about the questions he was answering at Big Ten Media Day, but it's clear to me that the reports prior to Media Day are the fact that Zach Smith was arrested for felony counts of domestic violence, which the only plausible felony domestic violence here would be serious physical abuse and felonious assault, that he was arrested for those things. That's the report prior to Big Ten Media Day, and then like you said, a week later, it's been walked back from arrested on those felony counts, to arrested, investigated, to investigated, and then even by August 1st, I believe it's just turned into allegations at that point. A tremendous walk back and no corrections, and the fact that the media has basically been silent on that issue. Even the people who cover the media, like Richard Deitch for SI, who I love him. I've been following him for years. I think he just interviewed McMurphy and barely asked him about it. I just don't see how that's possible or how that's fair.
So I don't want to ask you to speculate, but where would have McMurphy gotten the original report on all this?
I actually just saw something this morning on the Dispatch that he got it from one of Courtney Smith's relatives, which to me means he should have. If he got it from an attorney or from law enforcement or from public records office, you could probably use it and run with it. But getting it from a relative and then not following up with any agency or anything, that's questionable to me. I don't know what your opinion would be on it if you got such a report.
Well, we've got at least, so we know there are at least two reports, one from 2015, one from 2018. Do you think there are three reports out there?
I think so. 11 Warriors has published two. I was able to obtain two. I've only seen two, but that interview that 11 Warriors, the United States blog, published with the Powell police chief, sounds like he was hinting like there was a third report. But at this point, I don't know why McMurphy's released released a lot of evidence here, and I don't. Given that this highlighted a big issue in this case, I would ask your opinion as a journalist why you think he hasn't released it.
For me, that's the thing I've been trying to figure out. My theory on this is that he either didn't see the report directly, he was just informed of its contents, so he never had it in his possession to show, or he got it from somebody that maybe didn't want him making it public. That's the only two things that I can figure out, because if he's got it, and I've never actually questioned that he does have it, like you said, it sounds to me like the Powell Police Department has, without confirming it, has suggested there is a third report out there. So I don't question that. I just either think he never had it in his possession or he got it from somebody that didn't want him making it public.
Yeah, and that's fair. I just, given that the issue was, I did not expect that whole thing to go viral. I mean, I posted it on Reddit. I noticed everything Sunday morning. I took all those screenshots. Or actually, I went and posted it, and then I went and golfed, and then I came home, and so a lot of attention's been drawn on it. So I'm surprised he hasn't published it, but that's obviously within his journalistic discretion.
So we have at least two reports, maybe a third. Why would those initial reports have been edited? What are the legal reasons that some of those changes may have been made?
Well, reports aren't finalized. They go through a process. There's an investigation at the scene. They bring it back. The head of police or somebody at the department reviews it, and then there's a final police report. So I believe one may have been kind of from the scene and before it was finalized, and another one would have been after a more senior investigative officer looked at it, and that makes sense because if you look at the two officers. I don't recall their exact names, but the one, if you Google his name and, Powell, he seems like a younger guy. And then the second report is a officer who has a ton of experience, and if you Google him, he's recognized, and he's got all these awards in Powell. So maybe he was, revising things. So I don't think there's any foul play involved, but the report wouldn't have been finalized until charges were filed. Until it was set in stone what they were going to do. So that's just kind of, I don't see any foul play. That's been something we talked about. I just don't see that, within the Powell Police Department.
What's your stance on his editing the post and how he went about that?
Yeah, like I've I just don't even see how this is debatable. Like I said earlier, Ari Wasserman is the only one I've seen put in writing Brett McMurphy's post. But I mean, if you quoted me in an article and spelled my name wrong, you would issue a retraction and a correction, and you would make it clear. And going through and editing Facebook posts on this big of a story, I mean, let's face it, aside from the alleged QB controversy down in Alabama, there's like nothing else going on this college football offseason. This is all everybody in college football is talking about, and the news generally. To go and make those types of corrections without issuing a retraction, or out even, he could have issued a tweet. I've updated my Facebook post to revise, because here's the information we now have. I understand stories change. I understand stories evolve. But when you do that, you issue corrections. You make it clear, and he never did that here. I mean, I don't know why I'm rambling about it. You're the journalist. I mean, what do you think about it? What would your practice have been?
Yeah, I think it's very clear if you materially change a story more than let's say a typo. I think you have a duty and an obligation to make sure people know why you're changing it, and if it has materially changed, I also think you need to issue an apology if it's based on something that was inaccurately reported. And for whatever reason, the report was inaccurate at first, and even if it was a forgivable mistake, like reading a report that had wrong information at first, I think that would have been justified with him just coming out and saying, "Hey, I'm sorry. This is what the report said. I need to correct this," and then be done with it. I think it's ethically very shady to make those changes without explaining why and making a note that you are changing it. So do you think the editing would have at least we can't know what's going through Urban Meyer's head for sure, but on media days, do you think that editing did impact how he answered the questions at media day?
Well, I mean, I think the same way Trussell was known as being the senator and giving PC non-answers, Meyer is known, for anybody who follows the program, as speaking in absolutes and hyperbolics to the point I find it annoying, if I'm completely honest. A specific example I remember, and I don't know why this one sticks out, but before we played Buffalo, it was in 2012 or 13, and Meyer was talking about this defensive end for Buffalo, and this guy's one of the greatest defensive end we're ever going to play all year, and I'm just like, oh, for God's sakes. Here he goes. No matter who we're playing, they got one of the best players of all time on their team, and that defensive end happened to be Khalil Mack, and I think he returned a fumble for a touchdown and had an interception, and he absolutely murdered us all day. So Meyer was actually correct on that one. But he speaks in these absolutes. He that's just how he talks, and combine that with the coach speak and the general flair of giving non-answers. I just I think it certainly could have impacted what he was responding to at media day.
There's been some talk about the morals clause and how Urban could get fired for the morals clause. Could these edits and Meyer's subsequent comments at media day, could they impact could that play a role in him being fired, do you think?
I don't think the media comments in themselves would trigger the morals clauses. There's one that specifically states fraud and dishonesty. Just from a rational perspective, if we were going to suspend every coach who lied, if we were going to trigger a morals clause for every coach who said an untruthful statement at a press conference, then like I said in my post, our teams would be coached by Sesame Street. But I think it could be a factor, if we're being fair and impartial here, I think it could be a factor in the overall analysis. Because it's certainly, I think even Urban agrees, and I think he, said as much in his statement that he wished, he handled things better at media day.
One last question I want to get to, and then we're going to move on to kind of the legal aspect from Ohio State's point of view. I don't believe there's anything to this, but people have been throwing this out there because of McMurphy's reporting, and I do want to ask you just a legal stance on it. So, would there be any justification when the dust settles on all this, from what you've seen so far? Would there be any justification for those things like libel by the Myers against McMurphy, or tortious interference, or libel against any kind of defamation against Zach Smith? Do you see any legal basis for any of those claims right now that people have been talking about?
I think it's way too early to enter into that analysis. Just the legal analysis we're about to discuss. I think I wrote somewhere between 6,500 and 7,000 words, and analyzing any of those types of things would require a similar analysis, because there are a ton of issues in those claims. And it's too early. We don't know the facts. We don't know what's going on. And it's way too early to tell at this point. It just is.
So let's jump into the legal side of it. There was some news that came out last night, Wednesday night. If you're listening to this, Thursday night or Friday, but this came out Wednesday night that the Powell Police Department denied a records request by Ohio State investigators stemming from the 2015 complaints. The reports, they've denied access to those reports. I'm curious your stance on that, both legally and practically, what that may mean.
Well, I did see, as I mentioned earlier, there was an article in the Dispatch on this, and I think ESPN's reporting it as well, that, the city attorney cited a statute that seemed on point to me that says, if the person is not charged, we don't have to release the records. I am not a sunshine law expert, but I think that certainly is an interesting development. I mean, it basically, if the university cannot overcome that statute, then they, may not be able to get, all the documents, at least from Powell, which would be, that development, it surprises me a little bit, but the city attorney has to represent, the Powell is his client and his or her client, and if that's what the statute says and that's how it applies, then I'll defer to somebody who knows way more about that than I do.
I can actually add a little bit on this. I looked this up. It's Ohio Revised Code 149.432A, lowercase a, if you really want to imagine seeing it. It does say that there is confidentiality of people that are suspected in a crime but never charged. That is one of the records that is accepted to the public records law. So I can actually add that since I had that in front of me. So back to Meyer here. What do you think right now the summary is and where we stand on his case?
Yeah, I mean, the legal analysis, you got to go through, you got to walk the Candyland board. There's a lot of places to go, but, assuming that Meyer's statement is accurate, I mean, he did report everything, and we'll discuss whether he did have to report everything. Basically, the only way he can, the only thing that they can fire him for cause is under these morality clauses, and those are kind of vague, and they mean whatever you say they mean. But the other big thing, and this is another thing that's gaining a lot of traction in the press that nobody's looking into, or either they're looking into it and just not reporting why this would be deliberately. The 2015 incident was absolutely clear as day. I can't emphasize this enough. I would be willing to bet a lot of money that incident was not covered by Title IX, nor was it covered by Ohio State's sexual misconduct policy. And that explains why nobody from Ohio State has reached out to Courtney Smith. If it's not covered by those things, then contacting her is not appropriate. If I were counsel to Ohio State, which that probably won't ever happen, but should we reach out to her? No, absolutely not. That would be interference. It would be witness tampering. If those things don't apply, you don't reach out to her. So that's a really important conclusion. Even if Meyer had a duty to report, that's a really important conclusion to keep in mind, because the media is using, well, they've never even reached out to her, and trying to paint Ohio State in a bad light. That's just not accurate. That's not appropriate. I can't emphasize that strongly enough.
You mentioned Urban's statement of last Friday, August 3rd. He came out with his statement on Twitter. What do you make of that statement, not only legally, but the decision to do so?
Well, one of the only good legal analysis articles I've seen on this was from Michael McCann at SI, and he wrote a good piece basically saying that the statement had contract law in mind, and I agree with that. Meyer was saying, look, I followed the protocol, I followed my contract, I followed what I was supposed to do reporting-wise, and I'm not going to negotiate a buyout. I look forward to returning to the football team. And so he's basically saying, I did what I was supposed to do, and if you're going to terminate me, then it's going to be because of the morality clauses. And those are, we'll discuss them later, but I mean, those are, I don't know if those are triggered here. I just don't. I think the interesting issue and the unknown thing, and it's not really a legal issue, is whether the Myers statement was coordinated with Gene Smith, because again, the popular media narrative was, oh, Myers even willing to throw his boss under the food chain or under the bus. Oh, I can't believe it. Unbelievable. He'll do anything to keep his job. I think Meyer, anybody who follows the program knows that Meyer and Gene Smith get along pretty well. I have a hard time believing that Gene Smith did not give the green light for Meyer to release that report. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are. I'm obviously just hypothesizing.
Yeah, look, I know a lot of people don't like Gene Smith. There's some that are frustrated with him for past transgressions or perceived transgressions. But Urban, like you said, I believe Urban does like Gene Smith. I don't think he threw him under the bus. Whether he got their outright consent, to do that, I don't know, but I'm sure he or his attorney ran that by them before that happened. I don't believe he would have done that just throwing anybody under the bus. I don't think that happened.
Yeah.
You mentioned Title IX, and it sounds from your earlier comments you mentioned a few minutes ago. You read my column, so I think what my stance was in my reporting on Title IX. It sounds like you agree here that Title IX does not apply to this case. I'm curious for you to expound on that.
Well, I mean, it's inapplicable here for a bevy of reasons. And this is important. In any legal issue, the first thing you do as a lawyer is determine whether a statute applies. So, for instance, just an example, well, I want to take FMLA leave. Well, you have to work so many hours in the year, and your employer has to be this big, and this and this and this have to happen. And if none of those are met, you don't even get to an FMLA analysis. And so it's the same thing here. There's certain things that have to exist for Title IX to apply, and those just clear as day. And McMurphy's reporting on August 1st, well, he's got this Title IX clause in his contract, and it could be triggered. I just, for the life of me, can't understand how that report was issued 8 days ago, and I have yet to see any journalist stand up and say, let's calm down a minute. Because here's Title IX. Number one, it protects participants in educational programs and opportunities. Courtney Smith, regardless of the domestic violence issue, is totally separate from the Title IX issue. Courtney Smith is not a participant in educational programs or opportunities. The other thing is that, that's disqualifier one. Disqualifier two is that it only covers off-campus incidents if the university has substantial control over the context and environment of that activity. So, an example of that, could be an abroad program or something like that, or even in an athletic context, an away game, and they're up in a hotel or something. I don't know, but it's clear that Ohio State does not have any control or context over the environment in which the alleged domestic violence happened, because that occurred, I don't think anyone disputes that occurred at the Smith residence in Powell, which is about 15 miles north of campus. So, Title IX doesn't apply for that reason. And then the other thing, and this kind of is the same thing as the participant thing, but, Courtney Smith can't state a claim under Title IX. The Colorado lawsuit is pretty instructive on that point. And that one, I think the facts were even more arguable for the plaintiff because I believe some of the harassment occurred while the assistant coach was in a hotel for recruiting. So maybe they did have control over that environment. But, that accuser and that victim was not an intended beneficiary of the statute. She cannot use the Title IX protocol to establish a duty for the university. So that same analysis applies here. And, in this is important to keep in mind. I'm not at all saying Courtney Smith doesn't have legal recourse. What I'm saying is that it is in other civil and criminal contexts, and just what happened has nothing to do, at least in my opinion, with Title IX.
So that kind of brings us to the sexual misconduct policy. Of course, Title IX being a federal statute, the sexual misconduct policy being kind of a sister policy that is instituted by Ohio State itself. So what is your read on the sexual misconduct policy in this situation?
Well, the first thing is that, in my opinion, it's pretty poorly written. There's a lot of cross-definitional references. Things don't really match up. It's unclear what including means. There's things that seem like an umbrella term, meaning they encompass things, but maybe the other things are in addition to that. It's hard to read. But I think there's two. My conclusion is this. Paragraph 4 in there says that there's two interpretations of that. One is that it only covers sexual misconduct. And if you look at it, the sexual misconduct is very similar to Title IX. It's sexual misconduct in an on-campus environment or something that would create a hostile work or educational environment. That's not the case here. But if you more broadly interpret paragraph 4, and I think this is likely correct, someone actually pointed this out to me, and I appreciate their input, is that if you read it's sexual misconduct of any employees or, lists whatever, anyone covered by the policy, and that would be Zach Smith, and that would mean Meyer had a duty to report. So that would have triggered a duty to report for Meyer, and if he did that, then he honored his obligation. But going back to what I was just saying, 30 seconds ago, even if Meyer reported, that doesn't mean the sexual misconduct policy applied. And I don't think it applies for the same reason Title IX doesn't apply, and that's because the sexual misconduct policy was designed to protect the campus environment. And the policy only governs sexual misconduct, which is defined in the policy as occurring on campus or at a university-sanctioned event or conduct that creates a hostile environment for a student employee. And none of that applies here. And again, this is probably the third time I'm saying this, that analysis explains why nobody from Ohio State has reached out to Courtney Smith. Because if the sexual misconduct policy does not apply and if Title IX don't apply, then it would be not very smart to reach out to her because it could be seen as interference or tampering with an investigation.
Okay, so I want to ask you Gene Smith's role in this. Let's say it was insinuated by Urban Meyer that he followed proper protocol, whatever that means, and Zach Smith actually came out and said that Gene Smith had called him and brought him off the road out recruiting in 2015. So the implication here is Gene Smith did know. Whether Urban reported it to Gene Smith or he already knew, how would that impact the situation?
Well, I mean, if Meyer's supervisor knows and is dealing with it, then I think Meyer has an argument that the reporting is moot. If Meyer knows that the university is handling it, then reporting it doesn't do anything further. This is, the doctrine of mootness generally is that, if something has already been resolved, then you don't get to bring the lawsuit anymore. So if Gene Smith is dealing with it as the, statements were, discussed last Friday, then Meyer has an argument that, well, the university, my knowledge was that the university was dealing with it, and that's a good. I think that's a fair argument for Meyer to make.
All right, so one last thing I want to ask you, as far as the legal aspect, you referenced the morality clause earlier. We talked just briefly about it, but I want to get a more thorough analysis of that aspect of this. So if Ohio State were to pursue the morality clause as the reason, for Urban Meyer's termination, what is the basis that they would go off of here? How would that apply to the situation?
Well, we've come this far, and this is the issue. The other stuff, as we've painstakingly outlined, doesn't apply, and Meyer reported. So this is the issue, and these morality clauses are pretty broad. There's one discussing fraud or dishonesty in the course of his duties. There's one about acting in a manner that reflects unfavorably upon Ohio State's reputation. They're very broad, and I think the issue here, it's what I call in my post the Watergate analysis, because going back to that, the issue was what did Nixon know, and when did he know it? And that's the issue here. That's where the text messages reported by Brett McMurphy come into play. That's where all the evidence, as we know, comes into play. What did Meyer know, and when did he know it? The more he knew, then the more that likely that these morality clauses could be triggered. The less he knew, the less likely. The danger with these clauses, from Ohio State trying to rely on them, is that they're so broad. What the law just is what you say it is. The moral ground is just what you say it is. And when there are policies in place, and your employee acts in accordance with those policies, and then you say, well, that wasn't good enough, you're almost disregarding your own policies. And one thing I found in my research on these is that the employee has to be expressly or impliedly on notice as to the conduct that would trigger the termination. So here it wouldn't be express, I don't believe. I think it would be impliedly on notice. And that's a really difficult situation, and this is everything that the committee is looking into. What did Meyer know? When did he know it? And it's a tough argument for the university. The less they have to corroborate Meyer's knowledge. If they didn't have a lot of knowledge, if Meyer didn't have significant knowledge, then triggering these would likely, I believe, be inappropriate. And can I add one more thing?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
The thing with these text messages, it's obviously a big deal, but an interesting issue that we don't know enough about is that Shelley Meyer, I believe the actual word used is that she counseled the couple, and she's a nurse or a psychiatric nurse, and I believe they are bound by confidentiality. And if I can tell you, obviously there's an attorney-client privilege. I represent some very close family friends, and my own wife and mother have no idea about it. I don't tell anybody about it because that's the confidentiality that we have. So an interesting thing here is, we don't know this. Was Shelley Meyer, is there a privilege there? Is Courtney Smith disclosing these things to Shelley Meyer in some sort of psychiatric nurse-patient relationship? That's a really interesting issue. I probably could have discussed it more in my post, but it's certainly something to think about before we assume that Urban Meyer knew about all these text messages back in 2015.
Well, and I can tell you one thing that I will add on that. I haven't studied it closely, but I do know the sexual misconduct policy does list an exception for people in that role. And like you said, I think it would come down to, was Shelley acting as some sort of confidant in a legal sense? And that would be another interesting part of all of this. Hopefully we'll find out soon enough. So I want to ask you to wrap this up. Based on what we know right now, the facts as we know them, the things we've learned throughout this process, and obviously not taking into account anything else that could come out later down the road, just based on what we know now, how do you see this playing out?
It's hard to guess. Meyer is clearly not interested in negotiating a buyout. His statement says he looks forward to, being back with the football team when this is done. So he's basically saying, the only way you're going to fire me is via the morality clauses. And, as I just went through, those are vague. The other thing I didn't mention is it's very easy for us here to impose what we know now on Meyer. And I think that's a really important distinction. And it's very easy to look at these text messages and think, oh, man, but we don't know what Meyer knew. We just don't. And if Meyer's statement is true and he reported it, I think he would be it would be, the university would have very solid grounds, both legally and from a public relations standpoint, to reinstate him without even any suspension for those based on just the analogous cases I referenced at the very top. But Ohio State is in, a huge PR battle basically at this point. So I maybe he gets suspended a couple games, which I wouldn't agree with, but but I don't know. I don't want listeners to think, this attorney said this. I don't. I have no idea what the university is going to do, especially you mentioned earlier that investigator. I forget what her name is, but
Mary Jo
her
White.
track record, her track record, I just don't know. I just don't know what to expect from the committee or from the university.
I'm really, really glad you were able to make the time for this. It's been great to get your opinions on this and reading all your work on Reddit. And thank you for taking the time. I know you're busy, and although you did tell me you're going out golfing today, so I guess today wasn't necessarily your busy day, but it truly was great to talk to you, and I think people will appreciate your insight and analysis on this. So I want to thank you for coming on the podcast, and I'm sure people really enjoyed listening.
Yeah, it seems like this has run about 40 minutes, so I'll send you an invoice, $200 an hour. Hopefully viewers enjoy it. And if they have any questions, I'm on Twitter, Ohio ATTY 14. Just follow me and ask me stuff. I've been responding to stuff. I am going to a wedding in Nashville this weekend, but if you have any questions, these are the issues that matter, and hopefully people start really digging deep into these issues.
Stretch runtime here at Unscripted Ohio. Kick up your feet as we cross the finish line with the Buckeye Beat, the latest in Ohio State news and notes.
Kick the tires and light the fires, Big Daddy.
All right, Bill Benner, the sporting news with me now. Hey, Bill, I'm so glad you're taking time out of your busy schedule. It sounded like when I talked to you yesterday, you've just got interviews all over the place, which must mean college football season just right around the corner, huh?
Yeah, interviews and, talking to sources, the typical trying to get some writing done in between. But this is, always happy to join you. I think you and I definitely share a passion for the Big Ten and what goes on there. And obviously there is a big story dominating the headlines that I'm sure we have to address. But, this is where we're at.
Yeah, we do have to address it. We'll get that out of the way now. So let's start. I want to go back here. Ohio State's decision to go ahead, give Urban Meyer a paid administrative leave while they investigate this. It seems like from a perception standpoint, that is probably paying off. But things have kind of cooled down, and now I think it is back to what are the facts of the case. Did he report? Was he supposed to report? It seems to me, and I'm curious your opinion on this, it seems like Ohio State's decision to make this a fact-based situation and not all about perception, it seems that is paying off in the public eye. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that was the right decision at the time. I mean, I've told you and, I follow Dave Biddle very closely, and we've talked about it. And the percentages of what I think are going to happen change by the day. But, with the facts that are on the board that we know, absent of what might come out, would lead me to believe that Urban Meyer would maybe face some sort of suspension. He would stay on as Ohio State's coach. That would tighten up how they deal with situations like Zach Smith in the future and try to move on despite what an inevitable. But if they would have done this 72 hours after that, he was on administrative leave, it's a little bit different. I think, honestly, Kyle, if not for Friday's media blitz, this thing might be over by now.
I agree with you. I actually do. It's we'll never know what Urban was going through in his mind when he was answering those questions, but if he had just come out and been upfront about what happened, what he believed, and I think you're right. I don't know that we would have gotten to this point. So, you and I both think that this is probably going to wrap up fairly quickly. We were talking about that here before we started recording. Did you find it interesting that they put a 14-day timeline on the investigation? There were a lot of people that heard that, and they were kind of surprised that you would put a timeline on that. What was your reading into them actually saying we expect this to be wrapped up within 14 days?
Well, that they have to have some sort of timetable with the season coming up. They have a game on September 1st, and I know that's not nearly as important as getting, as you said, the facts straight. You obviously wrote a piece that was very interesting to me because I think the truth is an important thing, and establishing that something that stood out in your piece was that Urban Meyer is not a victim here, but Urban Meyer, I think personally, also deserves. We deserve to know what he knew, what he did about it, and what exactly is the committee. Let's say he were to be fired. What exactly is he getting fired for? I think he's not. You and I have probably had a coach or two lie to us here or there. That's happened. And I say that in light of what is serious here is, I think, what do you fire him of? And if I could do this all over again, if I were Urban Meyer, what I probably would have done is when Zach Smith, and that happened in 2015, I would put him on leave and for personal reasons and say, you're on paid leave until you figure out your personal life. I think that would have been a fair way to do this from the beginning.
One last question I want to ask you. There was a lot of people that were surprised from Urban Meyer's statement on Friday. And obviously now that we know Zach Smith came forward, it kind of makes sense as to why he would want to get something out there if Zach Smith is going public. But were you surprised that there are some people that perceive he threw Gene Smith under the bus. I don't personally believe that, but were you surprised he came out and said what he said in the statement?
A little bit, because I would think if you were on administrative leave at the university, and this is speculation, that they would have kind of told him, be quiet. And, for him to come out on Twitter, I look at it less about throwing Gene Smith under the bus and more about, okay, you want to fire me? Go right ahead. And it was kind of a dare. And that's how I look at it. I thought the Zach Smith interview was terrible for this whole situation. Not just for Urban Meyer, but for the fact that you have two people dragging their personal lives into the very public eye, where Twitter will make their own judgments, as you know. And, as me, just being a father, there's kids involved here. And that's, to me, just a sticking point that this is what I wrote Friday, and I think it sticks, is no matter what happens here, there aren't a lot of people here that are going to say they win. I don't think there are too many winners in this situation, and I think it's a case where, it's a test case for other schools and Ohio State included, that you have to get these things right in the future.
Yeah, I think we can all agree there's nothing good to come from any of this for anybody. For Zach, Courtney, whatever happened there, there's just nothing good for their family, nothing good for Ohio State, nothing good for really anybody. This is a whole bad situation all the way around. So we did have actual football start on Friday, and Ohio State doing their best to keep the media away as far as interviews have been shut down, so players are off limits, coaches are off limits, but they did get to observe. And so there's a lot of video that have come out from Ohio State's practice, and one of the interesting things is we've seen some video of Brian Hartline in action, and so far, first glimpses everybody's getting from him. The ironic thing about all this is I think Ohio State, perception-wise, maybe getting an upgrade on the field as far as wide receiver coaching, and Brian Hartline so far really popular among the players and media members.
Well, he should be. He's he embodies a lot of what Ohio State is. That's when you think about, and I grew up in the area too. When you think about an Ohio State football player, Brian Hartline, hardworking, max effort, got to the NFL, made big catches. Of course, he's going to be popular. And of course, yes, I think it's an upgrade too. I was over at practice yesterday too. I will say that decision took some criticism, but I think it's smart for Ohio State to let their coaches be quiet right now. And the players absolutely shouldn't be answering questions about Urban Meyer right now.
Yeah.
I mean, when the time comes for that, they can. But I think that's the right move by the Ohio State athletic department. And, but what you see on the field in very limited fashion is a very talented team. I mean, I keep going back to Chase Young and Nick Bosa. They're the ones that every time I'm out at that practice field, they're the first two I look at, just because you're watching two future first-round picks, possibly two number one picks.
Howard Griffith of BTN made a comment that he thinks this might be Ohio State's best passing attack they've had in many, many years. Just from your first observations of getting to see Dwayne Haskins and the offense, what were your first impressions of what you saw yesterday?
Yeah, I mean, the skill positions are good. I mean, those receivers, they've working with Brian Hartline, working with a new quarterback with a big arm. I mean, that's all you ever hear about Dwayne Haskins is the big arm. I think we talk so much about his passing that you forget that he's going to be able to run a little bit too and hand off to two very good running backs. Skill position-wise, this is a loaded offense. Offensive line is good. There aren't a lot of weaknesses with this team other than some inexperience on defense at linebacker and then the secondary, but they've always been able – you know this from being around them. They've always found a way to kind of make the secondary work and just spit out a couple first-round picks. So there are very few weaknesses. It's a team fully capable of winning the Big Ten, even without Urban Meyer. Do I think they would without Urban Meyer? Probably not, because maybe they lose that game in there that means the difference. But, with Urban Meyer, this is a team capable of winning it all.
Yeah, there is such a fine line. It's just, one little slip-up, it can be the difference. As we found out at Iowa City for Ohio State fans last year, one slip-up is the difference between you being in the playoffs and you not being in the playoffs. So it's interesting you mentioned linebacker. I saw Austin Ward noted yesterday on his Twitter account, my old colleague, he noted that Tuff Borland, even though he wasn't going full go, during preliminary drills was running with the first teamers. I thought that was an interesting note. Do you read anything into that? Like maybe they feel he's ahead of his schedule and maybe back in there sooner than a lot of people expect?
Well, considering the injury, yeah. And, Austin's another guy who does a heck of a job on the speed. That's the best part for me being around Ohio State is so many people do such a good job with it. And, that is interesting because when I think of Ohio State's linebackers, he was the first guy that kind of pops up in my head that has to, you wonder about his health. You wonder if he steps in because of his experience that he could play well. And, that's certainly noteworthy to know that he's out there because that would definitely suggest that he is, in fact, ahead of schedule.
So I'm curious, and you mentioned the secondary, the other aspect of this. Ohio State, it seems like the secondary is going to be very deep. It's just a question of are they going to have those hosses step up and be the shutdown corners that we've seen at Ohio State in the past. What is your expectation for the defensive backfield at Ohio State?
The one thing I'm watching is, Kerry Coombs isn't there anymore. And he was a huge difference maker, too. I mean, you're seeing him run around like the, Energizer Bunny that he is with the that might be a dated reference. I apologize. But with the Tennessee Titans. And I think, with Johnson in there as the new coach, I think their safeties will be good. Fuller could be all Big Ten type performer. But, yeah, they brought in 4- and 5-star guys. I know Okudah and Wade were ahead of schedule of sorts. So I'm wondering how much they contribute early this season because, those were 5-star corners. They were like, if I remember correctly, they were both top 5 in the position. And it'll be interesting to see how they contribute coming off the redshirt year.
He is Bill Bender. You can catch him on Twitter at BillBender92. And, of course, read his work on the Sporting News. Bill, it is always great to catch up with you, great to chat, and we'll definitely have to do it again here once the season gets rolling.
Absolutely. Sounds good. Thanks so much for having me on, Kyle. I know, and let's promise next time I come on, we'll talk more about football and less about the off-the-field stuff.
I'm hoping that will be the case. This should be settled by the next time we talk. This should be settled, and we should be talking nothing but football. So I'm definitely looking forward to it.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And that's going to wrap things up for the podcast today. Thanks again to our favorite Reddit attorney who I called earlier Bob Loblaw. And thank you to Bill Bender for joining me again. Coming up on Monday, the plan is to have our own Ross Walton of Buckeye Grove talk about the X's and O's, talk some more football. We're going to concentrate on the defensive side of the ball, what he expects out of the Ohio State defense. Kevin McGuire of College Football Talk will also join us. We'll get into some national stories, talk a little bit about Ohio State and some other football teams to pay attention to coming into the 2018 college football season. Also next week, we will talk to Clark Kellogg next Friday. We'll talk to Clark Kellogg and get into some Ohio State basketball. That should be a great time talking to Clark. Very much looking forward to that. So join us again on Monday, everybody. You can catch me on Twitter at KYLam8. Catch the show Monday and Friday on BuckeyeGrove.com, on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. Thanks, everybody. We'll catch you again Monday.
You can get new episodes of Unscripted Ohio on Mondays and Fridays exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all things Ohio State.